Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in the Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
This is the third episode in a mini-series looking at how Christianity in the 21st century is in for a massive makeover in light of recent scientific discoveries of ancient hominids which long preceded any biblical Adam and Eve of 6,000 years ago. In the first of those episodes, we introduced the listeners to some of the hominids who coexisted with humans hundreds of thousands of years ago. When our ancestors were migrating out of Africa and into Asia and Europe, we interbred with Neanderthals, Heidelbergensis and Denisovans. And I also mentioned that we have genetic evidence that prior to that exodus out of Africa, our ancestors interbred with yet another distinct hominid species. We also talked about how Neanderthals had a brain size a little bigger than our own, and by all appearances was as technologically advanced as humans. And we pondered a provocative question. If they were as technologically advanced as we humans were at that time, could they have been as theologically advanced as we were, given the evidence we have of them showing compassion for their wounded, ritual burials which indicate a sense of an afterlife, and carvings of what look like deities? And if there's any truth in those speculations, what about the most recent finding of Homo julioensis, whose brain size dwarfed that of Homo sapiens and Neanderthals? I mean, the brains of Homo julioensis was 50% bigger than our own. Now, a lot of Christians feel so threatened by these new scientific discoveries, they just put on blinders. They refuse to engage with the implications. For them, what's out of sight is out of mind. Or worse, some of them just deny the scientific evidence. They will quickly jump on a couple reports of hoaxes where bones were misidentified or even falsified and manipulated, and then suggest that many other finds, or maybe even all of them, are hoaxes.
Right, yeah, you think of the famous Piltdown hoax, and that has been very much exploited by especially the young Earth creationist crowd to besmirch, there's a lot of conspiratorial thinking on that side, that there's this kind of conspiracy amongst scientists to destroy Christianity. There's been a little bit of that, not conspiratorial. I mean, there are scientists who are biased against anything beyond the physical world, but they, most of them stick to the science and can be trusted.
Scott, the part of that Piltdown story that a lot of people don't know, I don't know if you knew this, is that a lot of young Earth creationists like to tell the story as if it was young Earth creationists at the time that caught scientists red-handed trying to pull off that hoax. But in fact, it was other scientists, secular scientists, who blew the whistle. They saw the data and they said, something's fishy going on here.
Yeah, so science makes mistakes, but scientists has mechanisms for correcting mistakes. That's the most important thing. And actually, not only that did scientists discover it, but I believe that even some theologians were possibly implicated in the thing, including Teilhard de Chardin. I don't know if they proved that, but that there may have even been some...
Implicated in the Piltdown story?
Yeah, implicated.
Oh, I don't know about that.
Yeah. So, anyway.
Interesting. So that's Christians denying the scientific evidence. They just reinterpret the scientific findings to fit their young Earth creationist model. The bones are just simply relabeled as either human, possibly with some injuries or disease, or non-human apes. Abracadabra and no more hominid ancestors, just humans and apes, like the Bible says.
Or they say the Bible says.
Exactly. Other Christians just dismiss those hominids as unconnected to us. They might not be apes, like AIG will say, but they're certainly not us. They're not human, they would say. Ask them to explain the criteria they would use to decide that only the organisms on one side of a continuum can be considered human, and therefore participate in this human-divine relationship, while the other organisms on the other side of the same continuum are excluded from all of that. If you ask them, they just won't be able to explain what those criteria are, unless they find ways to still somehow point to one particular primal pair or one particular primal tribe. One way they do this is to insist that God took one or more of those ancient hominids and gave them a massive upgrade, a refurbishing, with new hardware and new software, and abracadabra, now we have the first humans. But the fact is we don't have any evidence of that line in the sand. No evidence of a deviation in the hominid line so severe that you can easily say, here we find the first humans. Today in this episode, we want to tackle that kind of thinking by showing our listeners the parallels between human evolution and evolution of language. And we'll do this with an example that all of our listeners are already basically experts in: English. To do this, I wanted to find an expert on the evolution of the English language. So I did a Google search for linguist expert origin of English. And one of the first hits I got was a series of tech support videos that a Dr. Gareth Roberts created for Wired magazine. I reached out to Dr. Roberts. I told him what kind of an episode idea that I had in mind, and he replied an hour later saying he'd previously heard about the podcast and he'd love to join us for a conversation. Dr. Gareth Roberts is an associate professor in linguistics at University of Pennsylvania, a member of the Penn Evolution Cluster, director of the Cultural Evolution of Language Lab, and co-director of the Social and Cultural Evolution Working Group at UPenn. And as he tells us how English evolved, we'll stop from time to point out how this evolution of this language is so much like evolution of humans. But even when we don't do that, I want the listeners, you listening, to keep noticing those similarities. As he speaks, make comparisons in your mind. Ask yourselves, how is this like human evolution or even biological evolution in general? Once you start looking at it, it will become more and more obvious how this is a great way to explore human evolution.
Yeah, it's an interesting parallel. I've always been quite interested in how language changes and evolves. It's interesting that since the Enlightenment, we've kind of tried to codify language, like, create dictionaries and things like that. But language is not imposed. Like, there's not some central group that says this is how the language will now change and so on. It's fluid and it really does evolve. And then all we do is kind of track that evolution. That's what linguists do.
With Gareth's help and this analogy of English evolving over the centuries, I'm hoping this will give you, the listeners, a great example and a mental image of Homo sapiens evolving from another species. One which looks a lot like us, for example, Homo heidelbergensis, and then both of those coming from another species which otherwise looks completely different, Homo habilis or Australopithecus, for example. In exactly the same way that you can recognize the Lord's Prayer spoken in the style of English from the 1500s,
Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name.
Even though that's noticeably different from the Middle English of the 1300s.
Our Father that art in heavenus, hallowed be thy name.
Which in turn evolved out of Old English from the year 1000.
Fader ora, thu the art on heavenum, see the nama je hallrod, to bekomme din rich, je worde din will on erden swaz on heavenum.
All three of those are perfect
English,
English, but you can easily hear how one changed dramatically into the next one in the series. So with that, let me welcome Dr. Gareth Roberts into this discussion.
Yes, welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for coming on. So you're not a recovering evangelical, but you'd heard about us already.
Yes, I have some friends who would, I guess, fit in that category, who have listened to your podcast and spoke fairly highly of it. So I'm delighted to be on.
We'll have to make sure to pay them off somehow. Yeah. So, Gareth, you do research at UPenn using artificial languages that your students have just made up, as I understand it, to study the evolution of language. So tell us about that whole, what you do at UPenn.
Yeah, sure. So, this is a somewhat unusual kind of experiment within linguistics. Most experiments in linguistics use actual natural languages, but there's a sort of relatively substantial minority of people in the field, especially in the field of language evolution, do work using these artificial languages or non-linguistic communication systems, where typically we'll have participants in the experiment learn an artificial language or communicate with each other, perhaps with some novel medium. And then the idea is to look at what happens to these languages or these communication systems over time. And it's a way of simulating what might have happened in natural languages outside the lab over time. The idea is to sort of abstract away a little bit from the languages the participants bring into the lab. That's the sort of idea here.
So do you watch Black Mirror? Have you watched
I have watched some Black Mirror, yes.
Okay, there was that one episode, I can't remember the name, but basically a guy who was developing software, I think it was a game, but he had these little bots that began to develop their own language, and he's learned to speak to them. Is that the kind of thing that you and your students are doing?
What I don't do is actual computational simulations. So I don't have bots which speak languages, but I know a number of people who do that kind of work where you have these sort of languages evolve in a simulation. In this
Right.
case, we're really talking about we're using humans as bots, if you like, to learn these languages and interact with each other and see what happens over time.
And is it just pure intellectual research, or is there an application for this?
I'm interested in why and how language changes. So in that sense, it's really what's sometimes called blue sky research, right? So we're sort of trying to understand the world. There's not an immediate sort of application that my work in particular tends to work towards. There are applications to studying language change and language and social linguistics. Some of this related perhaps to things like, broadly speaking, with linguistics, is speech technology, things like that, for instance. Also trying to understand how to teach languages to people, has very obvious practical application, things like that. But my research isn't directly applied to that.
Okay. And I forget if you gave us some insight into how you come up with an artificial language. I know in some of the research that we did, we would have standardized research tools, standardized protocols, chemicals. Things were standardized. And so, for example, if you were doing research in cigarettes and cancer, there was a certain brand of cigarettes that everybody used. So artificial languages, are your students making up languages? How do you do that? Or do you have these little pre-packaged artificial languages that they have to use?
So some experiments we do will make up a language. And when I say language, we're talking something really simple, something like maybe between 10 and 20 words with some very basic grammatical rules. And we'll give students perhaps examples of sentences in these languages, and we'll expose them to it. The idea is they'll have to try and learn it and then try and use it with each other. And really here we're sort of just generating made up words. You can write a very simple computer program, for instance, to generate these words. Maybe pick out the ones which seem to work, don't look too much like a word in the language your participants speak. Other experiments we'll actually have a novel communicative medium. For instance, I have an experiment where participants communicate by moving their finger around on a trackpad, and then this generates colors on the screen, and they communicate by sending colors to each other. So yeah, that's the kind of idea. And as I say, really sort of for the pre-packaged experiments, we're really talking tiny miniature artificial languages of a very small number of words typically.
Okay.
I'm curious if are the works of Tolkien and his development of various languages at all illustrative or helpful in your studies? I mean,
Those, I would say, are a lot more intricate. One of the rules, I guess, for doing an experiment is you don't want anything to be more complicated than it needs to be. Whereas a rule for creating a language for detailed world of like Middle Earth, you really want it to be as detailed as you can make it.
well, from what I understand, Tolkien was a linguist, right? I believe.
Yes, that's right.
And Middle Earth, from what I read at least, was created to give his languages a place to live, in a sense, right?
Yes, right, exactly. Which and
Yeah,
yeah,
it's
he
fascinating.
really ran with it.
Yeah, he really ran with it.
Gareth, we wanted to learn about the evolution of English because, as I said earlier to our listeners, the evolution of English and the evolution of humans, there's an amazing parallelism in there conceptually. We can all relate to the evolution of English. We can now apply the same principles to the evolution of humans. So that's why we reached out to you, Dr. Roberts, and we'd love to hear from you. So why don't I just give you the floor for 5 or 10 minutes to talk about the evolution of English?
Sure. So I think people often might think of English as being the indigenous language of England, for instance. But if you, like me, are Welsh and consider ourselves to feel we have a sort of cultural connection with the Britons who lived in Britain before the English, we sort of think of the English as perhaps being really more sort of newcomers, if you like. By North American standards, newcomer doesn't really work. So we're talking about roughly let's say the 5th century, where you had migrations or invasions, or depending how you want to look at it, of Germanic-speaking people from continental Europe. So roughly the area which we now think of as southern Denmark, northern Germany. You had Angles and Saxons coming over from that part of Europe and really settling in relatively large numbers. There's a debate about how large these numbers were in the area we now think of as England. And there'd been sort of raids from the 3rd century onwards by these sort of North Sea Saxons. And then in 410, the Romano-Britons asked for help from Rome. The Roman legions had left Britain by that point, and Rome was already having its own trouble with Germanic invaders and sent back the message that Britain should look to its own defense. And this is really the sort of, and basically from then on, you have this relatively big movement of these Germanic settlers. You also get Jutes in the southeast of England from what's now, ultimately, at least likely from that area of northern Denmark known as Jutland. So that's where these groups are coming from. And they would have spoken varieties of what we think of as North Sea Germanic is the term sometimes given to it. And that's a subfamily of West Germanic. West Germanic includes many of the Germanic languages we think of today, like German, Dutch, English. North Sea Germanic includes really English, Frisian, which is language spoken in Friesland, which is sort of now covers areas of what now Netherlands and Germany. And Old Saxon, which is the ancestor of Low German, which is now constitutes varieties of Dutch and German. And did you sort of sense the timeline? So West Germanic would probably have been sort of roughly the same kind of language around the sort of 3rd century AD. And the North Sea Germanic varieties would have been a set of dialects which are a bit closer to each other. And then the Germanic language family would have been, a fairly recognizable separate language from other Indo-European languages, significantly before, let's say, 500 BC. And to the Germanic language family belongs, it's very hard to be sure about dates at this point where we don't have.
And you said BC.
Yeah, BC. So we're talking,
wow.
Germanic language family would have, really. So we're talking about Germanic language family is one subfamily of the Proto-Indo-European, of the Indo-European family. So, and that includes most languages in Europe, apart from a few like Basque, Hungarian, Finnish, Estonian. It also includes a number of, but not all, languages in Asia, like Hindi and Persian, for instance. And this Proto-Indo-European ancestor of these Indo-European languages would have been spoken as a single language, roughly, we're talking now a few millennia BC. So we're talking somewhere between 2,500, 4,500 BC, somewhere around there. And there's debate over exactly, when this would have been. We don't see any writing appear until much, much more recently. So first writing comes in a little bit later in Egyptian and Sumerian, so around sort of maybe about 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. And then the first writing in an Indo-European language is in Greek, which comes around sort of, 1500 BC, roughly there, with Linear B, if I remember correctly.
Now, I, as a child, was raised with the idea that all these languages, they all happened at the Tower of Babel.
Uh-huh.
How did these languages come up? You've listed a dozen already. How did they all come up? What were the influences that drove one group of people to start talking differently?
Yeah, good question. So let's go back to this Proto-Indo-European language, which, as I say, is the ancestral language, we can say fairly confidently, of most languages in Europe, a number of languages in Asia. And we have a number of other language families around the world which may ultimately be related to it, but we can't really reconstruct back far enough to be sure. What tends to happen with any language is that over time, it'll change just naturally. Put another way, all languages are constantly changing in small, subtle ways. So if you have children, you've probably noticed your children don't use a language exactly like you. And part of this is coming down to the fact that when we learn a language, when languages pass on from generation to generation, it's a reconstructive process. It's not a kind of digital process. It's a little, in this respect, it's a little bit different from DNA transmission. So what happens is children, and to some extent adults, will observe other people using the language around them, typically your parents, other grown-ups, and then try and reconstruct a grammar for producing that language yourself. And that'll bring changes with it. And then you'll get sort of little subtle changes come about because we're all trying to use these languages to solve communicative problems. We want to say something. We can't figure out exactly how to say something. We'll say something a slightly different way, and this will be interpreted a particular way, and that can lead to changes in the language. For instance, at some point in the history of English and a few other languages, someone might have said, "I'm going to buy a horse." Now, by going, word go means move through space. They literally meant go. But in saying that, they're also conveying that they intended to buy a horse. So now, as a result of this reanalysis, this reinterpretation of the verb go, so if you listen to someone say, "I'm going to buy a horse," they're conveying two things. One, they're moving to a place where they buy a horse, and they're also conveying that they intend to buy a horse. So now we've reached a point in language where you can say, "I'm going to buy a horse," and you might not even be talking about moving at all. You might be about to click a button on a computer and buy a horse that way. So there's that kind of change that'll happen. You'll also get social pressures on the language. So different groups of speakers might end up moving around, migrating, becoming separated by geographical barriers. So they'll end up little changes which accumulate in different places will accumulate differently because there's a lot of randomness to this, and they'll end up speaking differently. But sometimes you'll have groups of speakers where there's really more of a social barrier between them. So maybe you interact more with certain types of people and less with other kinds of people. So that can be a kind of barrier which will lead you to your language to diverge slightly differently. Or you might even deliberately not want to talk like those other people. You might not like those people. You might feel you don't want to be associated with those people. So you'll end up sort of deliberately sort of nudging your language away a little bit. You see this sort of, I guess, a recent example of this to some extent comes at the end of the former Yugoslavia. So I actually knew, as an undergraduate, I knew the guy who wrote the Teach Yourself Serbo-Croat book. And then the Yugoslavia broke up, and now there's a Teach Yourself Croatian book and a Teach Yourself Serbian book. And you'll see there are certain features, and really we're talking about different varieties of the same language, but you'll see in that case and in many other cases like that, speakers of these different languages may switch a little bit to using forms which are particularly associated with their dialect and less associated with the other dialect. You'll find languages diverge a bit like that. Again, you'll see this with kids as well. Kids will try deliberately not to use terms that their parents use sometimes because they want to sound cooler or a bit more like their friends or not like that clique and so on.
So you've already started to use one term, dialect, and you've kind of hinted at other ones. I think we should talk briefly just to help people understand when you study evolution of languages, there's different terms that you're going to use, and they capture different concepts that are important to distinguish. So, for example, accents. A person from the bayous of Louisiana and another person from the heart of the city of Boston and a third person from the Bronx in New York, they can use the exact same words and mean them in the same way, but the words, when they speak, it sounds completely different. So accents, regional differences, even changes over time, even the course of a lifetime of a person. And you mentioned from one generation, our kids, they speak differently. So maybe just talk briefly about some of those terms and concepts before we get into the details of the evolution.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So one term there, as you said, was dialect, and there are sort of a lot of related terms here. So dialect refers to a variety of a language. Usually we think of that as a regional variety. So as you gave examples of Louisiana and Boston and the Bronx, so people in different places speak a bit differently. Well, sometimes you'll hear the term socialect as well, referring to differences in social class. So posher people sound a bit different from more working class people, for instance, that kind of effect. Or you might talk about an ethnolect, so a variety which is associated with a particular ethnic or racial group. So an obvious example in the US would be African American vernacular English, for instance. So you'd have a lot of different kinds of variety like this. Sometimes dialect is used for all of these, and linguists will quite often use the word variety to really as a kind of catch-all term for all of these different things. So you'd say that people in this area speak a variety which is different from people in this area, and you'll also find variation between different social groups here, different social classes, for instance. You'll also, the word accent comes in here, where accent refers specifically to variation on the phonological or phonetic level, so how the words are pronounced in particular. Whereas dialect will include things like different words for things, different grammatical structures, that kind of thing. The other thing I guess to bring in here is that I think people often think of there being a very clear difference between two things being separate languages and two things being dialects of the same language. And in reality, it's much, much, much muddier than that. There's a lot of grey area. I gave the example of sort of Serbo-Croatian and Serbian and Croatian before. So people will sometimes decide that the dividing line is that two languages or two varieties which are mutually intelligible are part of the same language. If they're not mutually intelligible, they're not. But it turns out that gets quite hard. So many English speakers visiting other parts of the English-speaking world may find they don't really understand what people are saying locally. But if they spend a little bit of time there, they get used to the accent, the dialect, and they start to, and they get their head around and they understand it. So who do we count as being the arbiters of whether these are different languages? Or you might get examples like many speakers of different Romance languages can actually get by surprisingly well in other Romance languages. Romanians find it easier to understand Italian than Italians find it to understand Romanian. Basically, this gets very muddy, and it turns out really, and you find something very similar in biological species, in fact, of course, that really, when it comes down to it, we're talking about continua with difficult dividing lines, which is another reason why linguists will often talk about varieties rather than dialects and languages, just to avoid that oddiness.
As I'm listening to you, there's kind of a running joke between my wife and I. She's from Manchester, and
Oh, right.
so we watch a fair bit of British TV. And I'm always saying to her, okay, so you have to translate for me. because and it's really true, to be honest. Like
Yeah, no, indeed.
depending on where the show is set and so on, some of it for me is literally unintelligible. She has to basically, but once she does, then it kind of becomes intelligible, like you're saying.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's quite fascinating. So translating English for for another English person, yeah.
Indeed. And really, really that's a big part of what we're going to talk about. You get these people who historically spoke fairly similarly, and over time they've really diverged. And at some point, we probably want to say we're speaking different languages. Russian and English are related to each other, and we certainly want to say these are different languages. But at some point, the ancestors of these languages would have been similar enough that we would have been talking about the same language. And there's no one easy point where we can say, okay, this is when these two things stop being the same language.
Interesting. You compare that to biological species. I read Richard Dawkins' book on evolution a couple of years ago. One of the things I found fascinating was that he talks about how, in a certain sense, there really is no such thing as a species. We talk about, I believe in microevolution, but not macroevolution. You can't change from. But Dawkins says, well, there's no such thing as micro versus macro. It's all just one thing. It's one continuum. So it sounds like it's a similar thing in language.
Absolutely.
So one of the things we want to do in this episode is to, essentially put names to faces. So we want to talk about how different hominid species, and people might know the names, Australopithecus, Neanderthals, Denisovans, what have you. Those are the names to those faces. And as the analogy in English, we can talk about the English of Benjamin Franklin versus the English of Chaucer versus the English of King Alfred. So I think there's a lot that we can learn from you. Exactly how did it evolve? And the key thing that I want to do here is to put some names to faces. I mentioned Benjamin Franklin. We could talk about Shakespeare. Why don't you tell us about that evolution and put those names to faces?
Absolutely. So we normally think of there as being three main stages to English. We have the Old English period, which is essentially starting in the 400s as these Germanic settlers arrived in Britain, and lasting up until 1066 when we have Battle of Hastings, the Normans come in, and then you have substantial French influence ultimately on the English language. And that's a period where King Alfred comes in. There's probably one of the best known names there. Also, the Venerable Bede, quite a well-known, within certain circles, quite a well-known writer, speaker of Old English. Others like Athelstan, the first king to really, you could really consider king of all of England in some sense. And then from 1066 onwards, we had big influence of French on English. So in fact, the ruling class of England for several centuries then on mainly spoke Norman French, in fact. And that period includes people like Chaucer, as you mentioned, or Chaucer. Number of kings. The era of Henry IV, in fact, is the first king to speak English as a first language. Up till then, French had been the dominant language of the rulers of England. And we had this sort of shift over time where the ruling class ultimately came to speak mainly English. And then you have something that happened starting in the sort of 1400s. Going on to the sort of 1600s, you have what's known as the Great Vowel Shift. So there's a fairly big, somewhat complex change in the vowels of English, where the vowels sort of move around in the vowel space. So you have a word like beta, which became bite. So the E sound in bite, the E sound in what was ultimately beta became the I sound in bite. You have hoose became house. And if you're familiar with Scottish varieties of English, you might be familiar with areas where the Great Vowel Shift didn't happen, if you like. So you might hear a Scottish person refer to there being a moose loose about the hoose, rather than a mouse loose about the house, and so on. So you'll get that big change. And we sort of normally date modern English from then on. So
Gareth, for Canadians, this is a sore point because the Americans are always talking about us and the aboot.
Aboot.
Absolutely. And this known as Canadian raising, this feature of how the word about is pronounced, It happens in the US as well. It's worth saying there are a number of Americans have that too, but it's especially, as you say, especially associated with Canada, especially
Mhm.
by Americans.
The thing that comes up in my mind is how can we say, or can we say, that there's a proper way to speak any language? Is it people from the outside then who say, okay, we have to take this wild kind of process and somehow systematize it and give some of like so Johnson develops the first dictionary, and of course we have the OED, which tells us what is the proper. But is there such a thing, or is that something we're artificially attaching to it?
It's really quite artificial. And I mean, it's worth saying at this point that you will have institutions like l'Académie Française in France, which is deliberately set up to kind of standardize a language and to decide what the proper and not so proper ways of using French are. But most dictionaries, honestly, are not really supposed to be doing that. The idea behind them is really to record the language,
Mm.
including all its variety. What normally happens, and this is very, very common, I mean, this will happen to some extent in most languages, is you will have certain speakers will have prestige. And this will sometimes change the particular speakers who have prestige. And this will lead the way they speak to be seen as the best way to speak the language. So it's often to do with things like being associated with the capital city or being associated with political power or financial power or education, things like that. And it's really rather arbitrary. So one of the things that happened in the history of English in England, not notably in Scotland or Ireland, is that you had this loss of rhoticity. So most English people and also Welsh people speak English, non-rhotic varieties of English, which means that we don't usually pronounce the letter R unless it comes before a vowel. So I'll say my car. I won't say my car. Most Americans, Canadians, Scots, Irish speak varieties of English which arose. So you had migrants moving over to these places before this happened in England. So you have typically sort of rooted varieties, car. You have certain varieties in America which arose from later migration from England after you'd lost this rhoticity. So you have Boston English, park my car in Harvard Yard. And you'll also hear now, you still exist for numbers. So you hear Bernie Sanders, for instance, has a sort of Queen's accent with sort of variable rhoticity. Number of Americans still speak somewhat non-rhotically. And one of the things that's happened in the history of America is for a while, this was seen as prestigious in America. So having the non-rhotic accent, the same car, was seen as this prestige accent associated with England, it still had a certain amount of prestige. This changed over time. So then you had what was seen as prestigious in the Americas as Britain fell out of favor, America became a bit more confident. The rhotic accents, typical of most Americans, became seen as more prestigious, and now the people who have these non-rhotic accents in the Americas tend to be more sort of working class, tend to be associated more with sort of working class accents. Whereas in England, this rhoticity is seen typically as more, this non-rhoticity is seen as more prestigious. So if you say car, that's a sort of normal way for most English people. There are certain rural accents where you'll say, that's my car. And that's usually associated with it being a sort of very sort of a bit, not necessarily bad, but a bit country bumpkinish, perhaps.
Mhm.
It's got that.
It's just I grew up watching the Beverly Hillbillies, right?
Yeah.
And of course, they're the Southern twang. So then later in life, I worked for an American company that was based in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And I really remember very vividly sitting in a boardroom with a bunch of executives. So these are people of high intelligence, high professionalism, very well educated, and they're talking like the Beverly Hillbillies. And I'm having a hard time. It's messing with me because I'm used to hearing that as hick and uneducated,
Uh-huh.
but these are not hick and uneducated people. So it's really fascinating how that association happens.
No, absolutely. And it really is an association with the people who you associate with speaking the variety. It's in really very little about the actual variety or pretty much nothing about the actual way people speak, which make it sound worse or better. It's really very much a sort of social question about the people who are using it.
Mm-hmm.
So, Gareth, you said that you could try doing an experiment with us where you give us different versions of the Lord's Prayer through the centuries, spoken in English, what it would sound like. I don't know how you're going to do this, but
No, yeah, no problem at all. I have some down here. the West Saxon translation of the Lord's Prayer from the 10th century, and then I have the Wycliffe Bible from the 14th century and the Tyndale Bible from the 16th century. And then I'll read them out in turn, and I'll do my best to try and sound as accurate as possible. So this is not some people are a bit better at this than me, but I'll do my best. So I'll start with the Tyndale Bible, which is 1520s, 1530s. This is after the Great Vowel Shift had started, and certain elements of the Great Vowel Shift not sort of come to completion. So we have Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Let thy kingdom come, thy will be fulfilled, as well in earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, even as we forgive them which trespass us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen. So there we have something which is close to what I think we think of as the modern Lord's Prayer. And this is the kind of Shakespeare period. We're talking about Shakespeare in English at this point, Mary the First.
How do we know how these things were pronounced in these older versions of the language?
Great question. So we use a lot of different tools, if you like. So partly we can do sort of reconstruction. We see how these developed. We see what kind of changes happened over time, and we can work back from that and what would be the likely earlier forms. But we can look at misspellings a lot, or variation in spelling, and that'll often give a clue to, for example, if people write two words the same way, modern English, there. So THERE, THEIR, THEY, possibly RE. The fact that people often confuse them tells us that these words probably sound very, very similar. So that's a big clue. We can compare with other languages. And a lot of the time we also find with a number of languages, people write about how these languages are pronounced, because sometimes they want to teach people these languages and they'll talk about, or you'll also see the way the words in these languages are spelt in other languages, for instance. So quite a lot of different strands of evidence.
Okay.
And before we go further, I want to emphasize to the listeners, this is exactly what I wanted to do in this episode, is to show how a series of things that we're going to listen to that obviously sound completely different, but they are all English. And the point I'm making is, we would say, for example, Neanderthals are completely different from humans, but they're not. Australopithecus and Homo habilis, all of these are part of the same hominid line, but people would say, no, they're completely unrelated, and this is the point of this episode. So Gareth, go ahead.
Sure. So this now is from the Wycliffe Bible, the 1380s, 1390s, and this is Middle English. Our Father that art in heavenus, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, be thy will done on earth as in heavenus. Give to us this day our bread over other substance, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. And I think you can probably hear there, it's much more recognizable as the Lord's Prayer, right? And many of the words are actually fairly similar. There's a slight complication that daily bread is translated a bit differently. So the Old English version had a word, Yadai Hwamlich and Chlav, which means literally daily bread. You hear the dai in that, it means day. Chlav is actually the ancestor of modern loaf. But there's this complication of how to translate the word, which is normally translated as daily in the Lord's Prayer, which has been translated in the Wycliffe Bible a little bit differently.
And now, can you give us something from an older form of English?
Okay, so we got the Old English West Saxon Bible.
Okay.
Feder ora through the earth on heavenum, see the nama je halrod, to become thin rich, je worde thin will on earth on swazwa on heavenum. Orne je die hwemlich en klav, stille us to die, and for you us ora yilta swazwa way for you, orum yiltendum, and je led vu us on kostnunga ak alusus of ivela. So that's Old English for you, which sounds radically different from English as we know it now, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I recognize one word in there.
As you look at it and listen to it a few times, you might sort of pick up a few more words that you recognize. You see, so you've got on heavenum, which is in the heavens, for instance, and thu came in, which means thou. It's the old form for thou. One of the things that happened, you see the sort of effect of the great vowel shift there, where the oo became ow eventually.
So, and yet linguists would see that as English, though. Like that wouldn't be seen as a different language.
I mean, yes, it's part of, well, it depends what you mean by different language, right? It's a different stage in the history of English. If you were to come across people speaking that language now, we would think of them as speaking a different language. And, Frisian was a set of varieties spoken in what's now Netherlands and Germany, but still spoken today. And we think of them as varieties of Dutch or German. And they're actually not too dissimilar. If you want to get an idea of what Old English might have sounded like now if there had been very little influence from French and languages like that, Frisian is a good place to look for it, in fact.
So to belabor the point, you read 3 different versions there, and the first one that you read, I could understand every word, even though clearly there were differences, and I would make the argument that's analogous to comparing Homo sapiens to a Neanderthal. The second one that you read, the second, was quite different, but we could pick out a good number of the words, and maybe you can talk about Homo habilis, for example. And then the last one that you read, completely different, and I would argue that's analogous to Australopithecus. All of those are versions of English. I've just mentioned a number of different versions of hominids. We're all part of the same hominid line.
Yeah, absolutely. We're really talking about, very different languages, but they're all within the same chain, if you like. We're still talking about stages of the same language where you have gradual change over time towards what we're speaking right now.
So one of the main reasons that I wanted to explore the evolution of language in this episode, Gareth, is to use this knowledge to show how ridiculous it is for people to talk about there being a first human or a first primal pair, if one is going to make that claim from within an evolutionary paradigm. So to hammer that point home, Gareth, let me ask you, who was the first person to speak English?
I think basically that's an unanswerable question, really, because what we want to... But first of all, I mean, there are 2 difficulties here. One is identifying one person is difficult when we're really talking about a population, right? So we're going to date, if we want to say when did English begin, the only answer we can really give is to give a kind of historical event or set of events. And that would be really the migration of these Germanic speakers from continental Europe into Britain.
Right.
And we have a population. There's no one of them we can identify as the progenitor of English. So we have a population of people. And we're also talking about people who, for generations after that, spoke a language which was mutually intelligible with other people still on continental Europe. From the 8th century onwards, we had Viking settlements in Britain quite extensively. So King Alfred, we mentioned earlier, made this deal with the Vikings where part of England would remain under his control, and then you'd have what became ultimately known as the Danelaw, this big area of England under Danish control. And these Vikings and English people, they spoke languages which are different. The Danish Old Norse is a Norse Germanic language. There are already differences between those varieties and West Germanic by the time that the settlers came to Britain to found English. But they're similar enough. There was quite a lot of mutual intelligibility between them. We would expect Norse speakers and English speakers to recognize. It's a bit like maybe if you have a Spanish speaker and a Portuguese speaker, right? Or Italian speaker and a Spanish speaker. They're clearly different languages, but they notice quite a lot that they have in common, and they figure out quite a lot of what the other person is saying. And this had its own effect on English. Quite a lot of borrowing, in fact, from Old Norse into English.
Right. And to perhaps state the obvious, where I'm going with that question is, who was the first to speak English? It's an unanswerable question. I would say the same would apply to who was the first human. We just can't answer that question. If you understand how linguistics works, you can't answer that question. If you understand how genetics work, the same thing applies to who was the first human. That's where I'm going with all of this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's right. And I think from the linguistic point of view, yeah, precisely. You have this chain basically going back to Proto-Indo-European, but that's only as far back as we were able to reconstruct. We know that Proto-Indo-European would have had its own ancestors and so on. And we're probably, question I sometimes pose to my students is, how long do you think there have been languages? And they'll pull out numbers at the top of their head, and I think it's a difficult question to answer. I mean, we can reconstruct Proto-Afroasiatic, the ancestor of Egyptian, Hebrew, Arabic, a number of other languages, Berber, back closer, getting on for 20,000 years ago. But I think it seems likely that there have been languages, well, for a good while before that. That's just as far back as we've been struck. And you mentioned Neanderthals earlier. We know that humans and Neanderthals interbred. We know that we have evidence based on sort of archaeology and what we understand from the DNA evidence that this reflected sort of fairly stable family relationships. We had Neanderthals and Homo sapiens living together with having children, Denisovans as well. Presumably, they had something to talk about. We don't know that Neanderthals had languages, but it seems increasingly hard to find strong reason to think they didn't have something which would fit within the sort of scope of what we think of as language. So in that case, we've had languages have been around for hundreds of thousands of years in that case.
Right. About 3 years ago, we did an episode with Adam Rutherford about that very thing, that Neanderthals and humans are really, his closing phrase was, "We are Neanderthal. Neanderthals were us." Yeah, that was episode number 73 for the listeners. All right, so gentlemen, we're getting short on time, but I did want to do three more things if we can, three more concepts that are important in biological evolution and that how we can see the exact same thing in linguistic evolution. Just to emphasize a point that I think it's a perfect analogy to talk about human evolution using the evolution of English as an example. So one of the things that we will talk about as biologists, we'll talk about speciation, the creation of a new species, and we talked to Dr. James Shapiro in episode number 133, where he talked about this whole process of speciation, which involves taking two different species and hybridizing them. They are separate species, but they can interbreed and they hybridize, and that's how you then create a third new species. And Gareth, we were talking briefly through email. You can talk about this concept of hybridization of languages. I'll let you take it from here.
Sure. So, and this is one way, of course, so you can get new species or new languages, right? So you can get this contact between two languages and you get this new one coming out as a result of that. The best known example of that would be Creoles. So these are Creole languages, and typically, these arose in a particular historical circumstance in period of European colonization and typically in slave plantations. So you had a lot of speakers of a variety of West African languages typically taken to some place in the world and enslaved, and the people who ran the slave plantations spoke European languages like Spanish, French, English, Portuguese, typically. And what happened in these plantations is that you ended up with a language emerging which used a number of words from these European languages and often had many grammatical features from the West African languages. It ends up being a little bit more complicated than this because everything is always more complicated, but you should sort of roughly say, you'd imagine this as basically what happens is you have speakers of one language learning another language, and they kind of learn the words, but they apply the grammar of their own language to it. I think we might have all had experiences of this learning a foreign language. You find the grammar a bit hard, you maybe remember the words, and you sort of try and do the best you can, speaking French with the grammar of English, for instance. And this happened in the history of, in the case of Creole languages, you have these fascinating examples like Jamaican patois is an example of a Creole language, for instance. And you have these really interesting features where, so I'll give you some examples like me run, me a run, me da run, a run, me did a run. So these are English words, me, run, and this is referring to running. But what these particular constructions are doing, they're marking different spectral distinctions. What I mean by this is they're indicating things like whether something is progressive or complete in terms of the action. So I am running, I was running, I have run, I'm going to run, that kind of thing. And it seems likely that some of this comes from the West African languages that ultimately the ancestors of speakers of Jamaican patois originally spoke. So Jamaican patois would be an example of a new language. These Creole languages, like Jamaican patois, where you'll typically see the vocabulary will look very like the vocabulary of usually a colonial European language, but the grammar underlying it will typically reflect patterns of what's known as the substrate language, in this case West African languages typically. This is a sort of, if you like, extreme example of really what's a much more common process. So languages will come into contact quite a lot of the time, and there'll be a lot of borrowing between them. And it's not uncommon to have this effect where you have adults will try and learn a language and they'll apply the syntax of their own language, the grammar of their own language to the new language that they're learning. And there's some evidence this might have happened in the history of English as well. We know it's happened to some extent in various points in the history of English. There's some evidence it might, in fact, have happened in the very early days where you had these Germanic varieties moving into Britain and being learned by Celtic speakers. So you have some features of English which have been argued might reflect grammatical patterns from Brythonic, the ancestor of Welsh, Breton, and Cornish. For example, one example of this would be something which is really only very dialectal in modern English, the I'm a goin' construction, which still survives to some extent, I believe, in some Appalachian varieties of English, for instance. I'm a goin', I'm a thinking, this bit before the verb, which ultimately was a preposition. So the idea was I'm at thinking, I'm at going. And you get very similar constructions in Welsh, for instance. You also see this in Irish English. So you'll often hear Irish people will say, I'm after seeing him. And they don't mean I'm going to try and see him. They mean I am now in a position of having seen him. So I've just seen him. And this is really Irish grammar being translated literally into English. So these are clear as examples. You'll also, the other case where you get new languages emerging is, as in the history of Proto-Indo-European, the Indo-European languages, where you'll have a language will split into separate languages, which may or may not involve much contact from other languages. And often it does, because contact is very common in the history of languages.
And so the second biological concept that I wanted to unpack, maybe you've just begun to get into that. So the second concept is founder effect. In biology, we'll talk about just a small group of animals being somehow isolated in some way. They might have ended up on a completely different continent. So now this small population of animals, they undergo a whole different evolution than the parent population. And you've now eventually created two different species. And I thought, for example, and Gareth, you can unpack this, this is what we might see, for example, the old Celtic groups in the UK versus the Celtic people in eastern Canada versus the Cajuns in Louisiana. Maybe tell us about that.
No, sure. So you've got, for instance, in northeastern, eastern Canada, right, you've got, as you say, the Gaelic speakers, which is descendant of Scottish Gaelic spoken by settlers in Canada from Scotland. And you get some interesting features of that. So one of the features that I'm told is that you have what's called L vocalization, where you have certain L sounds will be pronounced as a W sound. So I think the word, I don't speak Gaelic, but the word for mouth, spelled B-E-U-L, I believe is pronounced peel. And I gather that in sort of Canadian varieties of Scots Gaelic, it's commonly pronounced piao. We have this more sort of W-like sound. And this is not an uncommon change. You have this in a number of different languages. You have it in London English, for instance, a bottle with boa, or that male cow is a bull for bull. A number of languages have this. Polish has this, for instance, quite extensively as well. So what this reflects really in the case of Canadian Gaelic is really, as you say, a sort of founder effect where you had a disproportionate number of migrants from Scotland came from a particular part of Scotland where this is the feature. And I think this is a feature typically associated now in Scotland with the Isle of Egg in particular. And then you have, as you said, Cajun, I think was another example you gave, where you have one feature, I believe Louisianan French is you often have what's called affrication of certain types of stop. An example of this would be cuisine for cuisine with a ch sound. And I believe this is typical of certain varieties of sort of Arcadian Canadian French, and they happen to be the migrants who moved down to Louisiana, and this just remains a feature there. The other sort of everyday example from English would be if you are not from the Antipodes or Britain, you might think that Australian English sounds very like the English of England. People often here in Australia think they're English. And this is really because you have most Australians relatively recently came from England. And in particular, they kind of sound quite a lot like people from the southeast of England. Not exactly, certainly, but you sort of, if you want to find an English variety which Australian English is most similar to, it's sort of, we're thinking southeast of England around sort of London. And this, you had migrants to Australia from all over the place, including Scotland, Ireland, England, Wales. But there was a certain dominance by speakers of southeast of England, and this has had its effect on the variety of English spoken.
So maybe I made an incorrect association, but I think my point will still stand. But I just want to clarify myself. My wife and I went to Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, and when Canadians listen to people from that part of our country, it's like they speak a different language. If you listen to somebody from Newfoundland or from Cape Breton, it's almost like they have a different language. And I associated that with the Acadians coming over from the old Celtic countries across the Atlantic Pond. And then I understood that the people in Louisiana were Cajun because they were Acadians. They were, and so I just thought that was the progression of a whole different language from the UK, now in East Canada, and then in the southern U.S., completely different languages, but it was the same people.
Yeah, I mean, I will say I'm not an expert on the particular history of the sort of migration to Canada and into the US. I think you've got one of the difficulties here is you've got two languages involved here, right? You've got sort of French and you've got English. But certainly, to my ears, if you hear a number of Canadian accents, they sound very noticeably similar to sort of Irish or Scottish accents. And this, as you suggest, really reflect migration from those parts of the world. And also, you've got the third language. You've got Scots Gaelic. So you still have speakers of this Celtic language, Scots Gaelic in Canada. Not that many left, but still a different.
Okay. One last biological concept I was asking Gareth about was ring species. In biological evolution, people noticed that there were several species of birds that they identified which looked almost exactly the same. There was important fundamental differences, and they were considered different species, but they were all located around the periphery of a very large mountain range. Birds could easily mate with the ones that were just a few miles away, but not the ones that were 1,000 miles away around the other side of this mountain range. And so the ring species refers to a series of very related species as you go around a ring, around a mountain range or some other obstacle. And by the time you get to the last of those very similar species, those last ones cannot interbreed with the first ones. So that's the biological concept. Gareth, I think we see the same thing in languages.
No, absolutely. And this is going back to what we've talked about before about these sort of linguistic continua. There's a historical example which was given for Dutch and German. We think of Dutch and German nowadays as being different languages, but it used to be the case, at least, it's a bit less so the case now, but it used to be the case you could walk or drive from Western Netherlands ultimately to Eastern Germany. And all along the way, you'd find people who could talk to their neighbors, right? So you'd find people, so Western Netherlands got people a bit further east of them, and a bit further east of them, and so on and so on. And there wouldn't be a point where you stopped finding people who couldn't really sort of talk to their neighbors very easily. But ultimately, if you take someone from the Western Netherlands and the east of Germany and put those together, they'd have a lot more trouble talking to each other because the Germanic variety spoken east of Germany, quite different from the variety spoken in the Western Netherlands. But you've got this sort of continuum all the way along. And this is one of the problems of thinking about this mutual intelligibility as being the basis for distinguishing different languages. It becomes very hard to apply in all the cases we might care about trying to distinguish them. You get similar patterns in English. For example, in the UK, you'll find that as you move further into the north of England, you'll get features of English within England which are also shared by Scots in Scotland. And then, as you go further into Scotland, the lowlands of Scotland, you'll end up with features which are quite different from the south of England, for instance, but again, a bit more close to what you'll find in the northeast of England. And then society and politics and all these things get involved, and you end up with these dividing lines appearing. So national lines between Scotland and England, for instance, or between Germany and the Netherlands. This will lead the varieties on either side of the border often to sort of draw more towards the political centres. So you'll tend to find the political borders will often mark a more drastic change in a language than you might expect. And this usually reflects the fact that you've got this kind of social linguistic effect where Scottish speakers will orient themselves more towards the Scottish varieties and less towards English varieties and vice versa and so on.
Okay, thank you so much, Gareth. So we are out of time. Before we go, though, Gareth, perhaps was there anything that we didn't talk about that you think needs to be said? Any concluding statements or a summary? And then I want to ask about maybe some upcoming speaking events you have.
I don't have a great deal to add. I'll just say, I think to summarize, I will say that languages have probably been around for longer than you think, and the dividing lines between different related languages are often much harder to draw than you might think, including the history of a given language.
Okay. And we're going to have links in our show notes for how people can find you. But again, you're speaking somewhere very soon.
Oh, yeah, I'm giving a talk actually at the start of July in Melbourne, Australia, in fact, to a group there. So if you happen to live in Melbourne, Australia, it's hosted by the Penn alumni group there. So I'll be giving a talk there. I also do a couple of, every so often when I have the time, I try and put together a YouTube video on language as well. So I have one or two up there. I've only recently started doing that, but that might be of interest to some
And you've
people.
still got the gig with Meta? You're the tech support guy at Meta?
Well, that was really just a sort of one-off gig. So they might invite me back again, but had a lot of fun. But if people are interested in seeing the Wired video on where I answer internet questions about language, then people seem to like it.
Well, that's how we found you. So thank you so much, Gareth, for giving us your time and expertise. It's been fun, and we're very appreciative of your time. Thank you so much.
Yeah, fascinating subject.
Thank you so much for having me.
All the best, Gareth.
You too.
Have a good day.
Take care.
Thank
you
you.
too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com. Join our private discussion group on Facebook by searching for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast group. Look for the logo that you always see at your favorite podcast catcher and ask to be let in. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts, or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.